It was almost 3 years ago that I made a video about why I prefer HDD over SSD, and I was discussing how the PlayStation 5 and Series X, this was before they even came out, but it was confirmed that they would only be using SSDs for games, and even if you had an external hard drive, you could not use that to play PS5 games. I think you could actually use it to play PS4 games. Same thing with the Xbox. You can play Xbox One games on a hard drive, but you can't play Series X games because it's just so advanced. It's too advanced for a hard drive to handle. You can only play them on SSDs, even though the same games on PC don't require an SSD. You can play them on a hard drive just fine. It may load a little bit longer, but it's still very much playable. You can't name a single game on PC or any other system, aside from consoles, because they restrict you. But there is a game that is yet to exist that technologically is not possible to run on a hard drive, and an SSD is an absolute requirement. Like, just absolutely, you can't run it without one. We have not yet to have a game that is like that. And I thought that 3 years ago, it was just a money ploy from Sony and Microsoft, especially since they were selling these proprietary SSDs where you can actually, like, never mind, like, buy an SSD externally and use it. No, like, for the PlayStation 5, you have to buy a specific SSD that Sony deems compatible with their console, and most of those are ones that they happen to sell themselves that they can make a little bit more money out of. So, yeah, I think it really just more came down to money than anything else, and it was marketing, like, oh my god, look at how powerful the SSD is, and also an excuse to have less storage on your system, because the PS5, after the stuff that's already installed on the system, like the operating system and all that stuff, you get like maybe 665 gigabytes, something like that, on the PlayStation 5, which for a system released in 2020 is absolutely pathetic when you have a lot of games where like one game alone runs 150 gigabytes, and the Series S, it is a budget console, but still only like 360 gigabytes after the operating system and all that is put into account. Yeah, so the storage is very small because it runs exclusively on SSD. They could definitely get a lot more storage if you were able to run games on a hard drive. It would be a lot more cost effective, but no, it's huge on this whole SSD thing, and it hasn't really materialized into anything that has actually benefited anybody, except for Sony and Microsoft that were able to sell these proprietary SSDs. It's just a joke when you think about it, because they were really pushing this whole SSD thing, saying that it's the next generation of video games. SSD is a huge part of that, but for the first 3 years of the life cycle of the new consoles, you're not only having games that you're also releasing on PC that don't need an SSD to run on PC, but also you're releasing these games on the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One. Halo Infinite got an Xbox One release. The new God of War Ragnarok is on PS4. So it's like, yeah, you're really focused on the next generation of gaming. Meanwhile, you're still designing your games around 10-plus-year-old hardware. It's just a joke. I mean, it makes business sense because the adoption rate has not been as high as it could have been if we didn't have the chip shortage and all that stuff going on with the supply chain. But this all is business, because they're trying to sell more of their SSDs, and they're trying to market their console to be a lot more impressive than it actually is. And I think it's safe to say 3 years into the new console generation, and however many years after SSDs first entered the market, SSDs have been extremely overhyped and a not very good value proposition, because if you look at the average price of a 2 terabyte SSD, which I actually have, so it's not like, oh, I'm just hating on SSDs because I don't have one. I have an SSD. I have a 2 terabyte NVMe SSD, the one they actually screw into the motherboard. But I paid almost $200 for that, and the prices are pretty much the same as they were when I bought that. So it's a little bit less than $200 to get a 2 terabyte SSD from a reputable brand. If you see anything like that's $100 or less, stay the fuck away from that, because there's definitely a big red flag as to why it's that low. But for the same price, for a reputable brand hard drive, for an HDD, you get about 16 terabytes of storage for around the same price, or a little bit less than $200. That's how much storage you can get. So literally 8 times the storage for the same price when you're talking about a hard drive compared to an SSD. it's like a no-brainer when it comes to which is the better option, which is the better value proposition. I don't care about the faster loading times. I don't care, especially when we're talking about open world games where you can have really long loading screens and it loads a lot faster and a lot quicker on an SSD. Cyberpunk's a good example of a game that loads a lot better on an SSD. But honestly, when we're talking about Cyberpunk, a big problem with that game is not much to do with the loading screen and a lot to do with the gameplay, from the shooting mechanics to the driving and all that being about 15 years behind. It feels like a game that could have been released in 2005, 2006. Not very impressive at all. It's a pretty underwhelming game, and those who are trying to like rehabilitate Cyberpunk and CD Projekt Red be like, oh no, Cyberpunk is such a hidden gem, it's actually just as good as The Witcher 3. Those people should not be taken seriously at all. But, another thing I mentioned in that video that I referenced that I made 3 years ago talking about hard drives versus SSDs, a big component that I talked about was the whole online multiplayer aspect of it. If you're someone that mostly plays online multiplayer, you're going to be loading into a game, you're going to be sitting in a long loading screen regardless whether you have an SSD or a hard drive, because when it comes to these online games, most of your loading time doesn't come from actually like your hard drive loading the game in. It comes from everyone, especially when it comes to a bigger game where you have like 30 people, 40 people, 50 people all connecting to one match. It's waiting for everyone to connect and all that. Like, that's where most of the loading and waiting comes from in an online game that an SSD doesn't really do much to alleviate at all. So depending on what types of games you play, you may not be seeing any benefits of SSDs, even though you're paying a huge premium for that type of storage over hard drives. I'm obviously not trying to argue that SSDs are completely useless and don't have any value to them at all. I'm just saying that considering the fact that it costs a lot more for SSD storage than it does for hard drive when we're talking about the same amount of storage, and considering how much of a commodity that storage for games is these days, how games just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger with no end in sight, I think it's definitely something worth considering when you're building a PC, when you've already spent a good amount of money from all the other parts. Is it worth splurging on all of that for an SSD that probably won't meet your storage needs, depending on how much you're willing to pay? Because 2 terabytes can go really fast, especially if you're someone that doesn't feel like uninstalling and reinstalling games all the fucking time. And, especially these are games that are like over 100 gigabytes. They take a long time. Unless you're someone that has gigabit internet, it doesn't really matter regardless. But someone like me that lives in a rural area, I have what you can technically call it high-speed internet, but when we're talking about a 100-gigabyte game, it will take me all day to reinstall that game. So it's a lot easier and a lot more efficient and a lot better for my time to just have a hard drive with a shit ton of storage on it. Obviously, have the SSD for the operating system. I think that's a standard now when it comes to PCs, is to have like 100 gigabytes at the very minimum for the OS, to run Windows and all that. But for your main storage for video games, for the storage of the bulk of your games and your video files and all that stuff, is to have that on an HDD. And then, if you want to have like a few certain games that you really like especially if you have open world games, you can get a smaller storage SSD. But I don't think that the need for hard drives can be completely eliminated in 2023 or any time in the foreseeable future, because yes, while SSDs have gotten a lot cheaper over the years, so have hard drives. So it's like it really is a thing that is very nice to have, but it also costs a premium, and it is more of a luxury thing that isn't necessarily needed. Again, there are 0 games in 2023 that require an SSD to run. 0. So it's not like you're going to be missing out on anything if you have a hard drive. And I don't think that's going to become a reality anytime soon either. I think we would have started to be seeing at least some of that at this point. We'd have seen at least 1 or 2 games or 3 games go in that direction, considering that SSD adoption has been relatively high over the years. But no, because the technology is not as big as it's been made out to be, where SSDs are such a vital and essential thing around a game's fundamental design. that it needs to have those short loading times in order to function properly. Like, it's just a joke. Sony hyping their SSD technology with the PS5 is the modern day version of Sega talking about blast processing with the Sega Genesis. It was nothing but marketing bullshit that had no actual meaning. It was just a way to market their console and make it seem a lot more impressive than it actually was. I mean, the Sega Genesis was impressive for its time. Even, I would say the PS5 is impressive for its time, but SSDs are definitely not a part of that, and it never will be.